Good afternoon. I have the honor of moderating the conference of Professor Douglas Cairns. Professor Douglas Cairns is a full professor at the University of Edinburgh, a world-known classicist, Hellenist, whose main interests are in the field of language, emotion, and society in classical Greece. And in Byzantine Greek. He developed several research projects in this field, and his publications, a huge list of publications and intense work. His publications are an obligatory lecture for a classicist. I evoke Sophocles' Antigone, London Bloomsbury 216, Achilles' 5 Epinician Odes, Cambridge Publications 2010, Eidos, a precious book, Eidos, The Psychology and Ethics of Honor and Shame in Ancient Greek Literature, Oxford University Press, 1993. And he edited books as A Cultural History of the Emotions in Antiquity 2 years ago. A very important book for those who study, everybody who studies emotions, performance, theater, literature in general, Greek literature, and body. The dynamics of emotion in Euripides' Medea, in Greece and Rome. He belongs to the scientific committee of very credited reviews. And after that, he was one of the founders of the classic Celtic conferences in classics, and he's a close friend of our university, our center, and a very a precious colleague of us, with communication that is a characteristic of the best of chosen spirits. So let us hear you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maria do Sal. It's a great pleasure to be addressing an audience in Coimbra. It's a real disappointment not to be in Coimbra. I wish I was. I wish I could join you all and enjoy the city, the weather, the food, the wine, the fado, and everything else that makes coming to Coimbra such a huge pleasure, as well as the fellowship of one's friends and colleagues. The last time I was in Coimbra was the Celtic Conference in Classics that Maria mentioned in 2019. And so that was the last place where I saw my dear friend, Anton Paulo, now sadly no longer with us. Anton was delighted with the way that the Celtic Conference went in 2019. He'd never been in Coimbra before. He was totally bowled over by the hospitality of the people and the beauty of the place, and also by the friendly collaboration in the academic endeavours too. We vowed that we would come back, that we would stage the Celtic Conference in Coimbra again, and sadly, when we do, Anton will no longer be there. But I do very much hope that in one of the next occasions that I have to visit Coimbra, it will be for a Celtic Conference in Classics where we can all drink to Anton's memory. So my paper today is called Homer, Aristotle, and the Nature of Compassion. To follow the paper, everyone will need the handout. So either you should have the handout printed in front of you, or you should get access to it through the YouTube page. So if you go just below the sort of visual image in YouTube, you'll get a link there which has further details. And if you click on that, it will expand. You'll find the handout there. And I'm pretty sure that you will need to follow the handout, otherwise the talk will be incomprehensible. It may be incomprehensible anyway, but the handout may help. I chose compassion as the name for the range of things that I want to talk about today, just because it's a relatively uncontroversial term. I wanted to avoid some of the issues that are matters of controversy, especially with regard to disputes over what is empathy and what is sympathy and what the difference may be between them. So I decided not to get into any of that and to let any position that I have on those things to come across without explicit fanfare, without technical language, without labels and so on, and without getting involved in particular academic disputes. So instead of that, I proceed by a fairly simple procedure. I confront the passage that's on the first page of the handout with the passage that begins the second page of the handout. So I bring the representation of pity in the final book of the Iliad into relation with the theorization of pity, eleos, in Aristotle's rhetoric. And that'll lead me to some thoughts on the nature of pity, the nature of compassion in Homer in general, before we then turn to the contrast between Homer and Aristotle. And that contrast itself will be further underpinned by some differences that I'll talk about briefly between Aristotle and Plato on the emotional effect of epic and tragedy. So for the first bit of the paper, I'll be moving back and forward between page 1 and page 2 of the handout, item 1 and item 2. So when I say item 1, it'll be somewhere on the first page. When I say item 2, it'll be somewhere on the second page. So let's start with item 1. This is the passage in Iliad 24, where in what's presented as an act of immense bravery, Priam enters the quarters of Achilles to beg for the return of Hector's body for burial. So Priam takes hold of Achilles' knees in supplication. He kisses the hands that slew his son Hector, and he makes his appeal. He does ask Achilles to respect the gods in line 503, Ideo Theus, but still the core of his speech is the appeal to Eleos in line 503 as well. Auton to Eleison, he says. The pity that Priam seeks is solicited with reference to Priam's own suffering, but it's also refracted by means of a relation of similarity and difference between Priam and Achilles' father Peleus. So at the beginning and the end of his appeal, Priam says, "Remember your father." And he emphasizes the closeness in age between himself and Peleus, and he lays emphasis also on the troubles that come with old age. But Priam says, in addition, that he's more pitiable, more to be pitied, more eleainos, in line 504, than Peleus is. Peleus rejoices in the news that his only son is still alive, whereas Priam has lost many of his sons, he says, in lines 490 to 498, including the one that he relied on most, the one he now calls his only son, Hector in 499 to 501. So Priam makes it seem as though he's like Peleus. They both have only one son, but Peleus's only one son is still alive. So Priam has this only son whom he's lost, Hector, and now what he's doing is putting the hands that killed that son to his own mouth in lines 505 to 6. So Priam wants to make Achilles see him as a father like his own father. Priam implies that what's happened to him might happen to Peleus. And so Priam's appealing to a point that Aristotle later makes a great deal of in the Rhetoric, namely the point that pity requires that we ourselves, or those that we care for, should be vulnerable to misfortune. We'll come back to Aristotle in a minute. But let's stick for the moment with passage 1, the Iliad. Priam's appeal to Achilles' memory of his father is effective. And Achilles and Priam then weep intensely together in lines 507 to 12. But Achilles doesn't accept that Priam is more pitiable than Peleus is. Achilles knows that he's going to die at Troy. We've heard a lot about that in the course of the Iliad, especially in passages in Book 9 and in Book 18. And so Achilles also knows that Peleus will soon experience a grief just like Priam's, as he says in 534 to 542 there. So in Priam's appeal to the similarity between himself and Peleus, there was also an assumption of difference. Since his only son lives on, Peleus, as represented by Priam, enjoys a kind of prosperity that Priam has now lost. And this is another of Aristotle's conditions for pity. The sense of vulnerability that's essential for pity, according to Aristotle, relies not only on a perception of similarity, that what's happened to this person might happen to me or to someone I care for, but also on a discrepancy between the pitier and the pitied, between the subject and the object of pity, in the sense that the person who pities is better off, at least for the meantime, than the other person. The vulnerability criteria in Rhetoric Book 2 rest fundamentally on the idea of potential suffering at some stage in the future. So the person you pity is suffering now. The person who pities may potentially suffer at some future stage. But Achilles contradicts Priam on this point. Priam makes an Aristotelian appeal, but Achilles gives a non-Aristotelian response, and that's something I'll say a bit more about in a minute. To support his appeal, Priam uses the language of likeness. His words, "Remember your father, Achilles, who's similar in age to me," in 486 to 487, bear comparison with Aristotle's words when he observes at 1386a25. I'll just abbreviate that from now on to 86a25. So Aristotle observes in 1386a25 that people pity those who are similar to them in age. But Priam's argument isn't quite the same as Aristotle's. Peleus isn't the recipient of Priam's appeal, and Achilles, of course, is much younger than Priam is. And yet there is a sense in which Priam and Achilles are making the same case, since the point of Aristotle's observation is that similarity promotes the sense of vulnerability. It's easier to imagine something happening to us when it happens to someone like us. Priam's appeal makes that point, but at one step removed. Achilles' sense of his own vulnerability is evoked by the similarity not between Priam and Achilles, but between Priam and Peleus. And this is another of Aristotle's points. As Aristotle further observes, those who have living parents or children or wives tend to feel pity because parents are part of us and they are subject to the troubles that excite pity. That's 85b, 27 to 29. So Aristotle's point there is that our parents and our children's vulnerability is our vulnerability. And so the likeness between Priam and Peleus is a sign of Achilles' vulnerability. Achilles is as vulnerable to misfortune as Priam has proved to be, because Peleus is vulnerable to misfortune, and Peleus' troubles are Achilles' troubles. It's evident that Achilles has taken this fundamental point as the lesson of Priam's predicament, because he presents it to Priam himself as consolation for his sufferings. So the point that Priam makes is immediately taken up by Achilles himself and given back to Priam as a general truth. After they've wept together, Achilles takes Priam by the hand and raises him to his feet. And then he delivers a speech that draws the moral from their shared lamentation. So we're still in number 1 on the handout. Achilles points out that no human life can be without pain. The best we can hope for is an alternation between good and bad fortune. And as examples, Achilles offers his own father in 534 to 542, and Priam himself in 543 to 548. So he underlines the similarity that was the basis of Priam's appeal. Both Priam and Peleus surpassed other human beings in prosperity, but divine favor deserted them in their later years. Peleus, Priam, and Achilles himself are exemplary figures, but they're exemplary of conditions that apply to all human beings. The vulnerability that's a fundamental condition for pity is inherent in the human condition, and the human condition is defined by contradistinction to the divine. In presenting the mutability of fortune as a shared human predicament, Achilles is in effect pointing out not only that all human suffering is potentially pitiable, but also that all human beings are potentially susceptible to pity as long as they're capable of realizing that their lives are like the lives of others, and all lives are subject to mutability. Achilles' speech begins with an explicit expression of the pity that's attributed to him by the narrator in lines 515 to 516. Achilles helps Priam to his feet, feels pity for his grey hair and beard, and begins his speech, "Ah, poor man, truly you endured many evils in your heart." That's line 518. So Achilles affirms that he's come to understand how Priam has suffered. But that understanding is rooted in the fact that Achilles has also suffered. And we see this from the way that Priam's appeal moves both of them to tears. Priam weeps, as we see in lines 509 to 10, because he remembers Hector. But Achilles weeps, remembering not only Peleus, as Priam asked him to, but also Patroclus, 511 to 12. And this creates an apparent dissonance with several of Aristotle's observations about pity in the rhetoric. Because Priam is in mourning, but so is Achilles. The tears of Priam are tears of grief, but the tears of Achilles are tears of grief too. Achilles' mourning for Patroclus has continued all the way from Book 18 to the present episode in Book 24. But equally, his tears for Peleus also express a form of grief that proleptically takes Peleus' suffering as actual rather than potential. Priam's grief for Hector and Achilles' grief for Peleus and Patroclus illustrate Aristotle's point in number 2 in the handout, that we regard the sufferings of those closest to us as our own, as he says at 86a, 19 to 20. And so the closest people to us are not normally appropriate objects of pity. We don't pity them, we simply suffer with them, 1386a, 18 to 19. But the crucial point is, for my argument here, that Aristotle also thinks that focusing on our own sufferings drives out pity for other people. This is why he says people who are utterly ruined are incapable of pity at 1385b, 19 to 20. These people are focused not on their own vulnerability to potential suffering in the future, but on the sufferings that they've actually incurred and they're actually suffering now. Similarly, people who are utterly terrified by the prospect of their own suffering don't think of the vulnerability that links them to other people, 85b, 32 to 33. And those who think that terrible events are imminent for themselves or for those who are closest to them are said to be no longer capable of pity at 86a, 22 to 25. So in all these cases, the agent's own misfortune is either present or just about to happen. It's imminent. The basic discrepancy that Aristotelian pity requires between the suffering other and the only potentially suffering self is absent in these cases. But it's absent also in the way that Achilles' pity coexists with intense grief at the loss of his closest friend and with vivid imagination of imminent suffering on the point of his father. So Achilles is suffering right now. His sufferings are present right before his eyes and imminent, just about to come. According to Aristotle, all of these things should rule out pity. Now, no doubt we can think of ways of saving Aristotle's generalizations from their confrontation with this realistic, detailed, and powerful mimesis of emotion that we find in Homer. We might say, for example, that Achilles isn't one of the utterly ruined. He's not one of the pantelos apololotes who think that no further misfortune can befall them. On the contrary, Achilles does know that there is further misfortune in store. He knows that the loss of Patroclus wasn't the last of his sufferings. His own failure to provide for Peleus in his old age and Peleus' grief after his own death illustrate the continuing vulnerability that he shares with all human beings. Equally, although the sufferings of Peleus are imminent, still they remain in the future. And we might notice that Achilles' situation isn't quite the same as the situation of those people who, according to Aristotle, can be deflected but from pity by being made to focus on their own troubles. So Aristotle says you can prevent people pitying if you make them think of themselves, become self-absorbed, rather than thinking about others. Achilles isn't one of those people precisely because in his case it's the opposite. He's been driven to think of himself because he's been confronted by another suffering individual as an object of pity. And this reminds him, 504 and 509 to 12, of his own sufferings. So there isn't the wedge here between self-absorption and other concern that's presupposed in Aristotle. Achilles focuses on himself precisely because he's exposed to the suffering of another person. Beyond that, there is a slight inconsistency, discrepancy in Aristotle's own account. When Aristotle makes use of an anecdote to illustrate the difference between the terrible, to deinon, the thing that we fear may happen to ourselves, and the pitiable, to eleienon, which is a characteristic of the sufferings of others, the anecdote doesn't in fact bear out his contention that the terrible drives out the pitiable. This is the story of the Pharaoh, Amasis according to Aristotle, Psamenitus according to Herodotus, so just different generations of the same family. The story of the Pharaoh who didn't weep when he saw his son being led out to his death, but did weep when he encountered a former companion reduced to beggary. And this is on the basis that the fate of the son was terrible, whereas the fate of the friend is pitiable. That's 1386a, 20 to 22. The Pharaoh, like Achilles, is faced with imminent suffering on the part of a relative that he regards as an evil for himself, to deinon. And yet he's still able to pity someone who's less close to him, to eleienon. So the terrible, even on Aristotle's own account, doesn't always drive out the pitiable. And the Amasis or Psamenitis story contradicts the statement that people no longer feel pity when what they fear for themselves is imminent. But however all of that may be, there remains a significant difference of emphasis between Aristotle's account of pity in the rhetoric and the dynamics of that emotion in the encounter between Achilles and Priam. Fundamentally, this is a matter of Aristotle's emphasis on potentiality as an aspect of the vulnerability condition. Aristotle emphasizes evils which lie in the future, and so he emphasizes fear as the attitude towards our own sufferings that complements pity as a response to the sufferings of others. In Homer, by contrast, despite the importance of shared vulnerability as a condition for pity, there's also a much greater emphasis on grief. Now, I emphasize that this isn't an absolute distinction between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle does recognize that you have to have suffered yourself in order to be able to respond with pity to the sufferings of others. He says explicitly that those who have already suffered are among those who are disposed to feel pity, as are older people on the grounds of their wisdom and experience. That's 1385b, 24 to 26. But those two items are items in a list of people who are disposed to think of themselves as liable to suffer in the future, 85b, 24. And so this list also includes the weak, people with a tendency towards cowardice, and the educated who know that suffering is possible, 85b, 26 to 27. By contrast, those who've been exceptionally lucky in life and those who've been utterly ruined by life don't have this sense of future vulnerability, 85b, 18 to 23. So life experience for Aristotle does matter. The experience of suffering does matter. But still, Aristotle's focus is consistently on futurity and potentiality. The troubles on which pity focuses are the kind of thing we might expect to happen to ourselves or those we care for, 85b, 14 to 15. In general, 86a, 27 to 29, it's the things we're afraid of in our own case that we pity when they happen to others. And it's perhaps implicit in this that these evils are also the kind of thing that would cause grief and lamentation when they do happen to us or to our loved ones. But this isn't something that Aristotle cares to emphasize or to bring out. And it's very different from that in Iliad 24. In Iliad 24, Priam asks Achilles to remember Peleus, but to pity him, to pity Priam, because his condition, Priam's condition, is even more pitiable, 503 to 4. And this moves Achilles to lamentation. The lamentation is called goos for his father, and goos is a typical marker of grief. As Priam then weeps for Hector, Achilles weeps for Peleus and for Patroclus. He doesn't, at least explicitly, weep for Priam, and he doesn't share Priam's grief for Hector. So Achilles and Priam experience together in the same place at the same time, the same emotion, but with different objects and for different reasons. Achilles doesn't adopt Priam's emotional perspective, but still Priam's presentation of that perspective is instrumental in making Achilles see the common ground between Priam's suffering and his own. Priam highlights a similarity between his predicament, Peleus's predicament, and Achilles' own predicament. Priam and Achilles already know, and Peleus soon will know, what it's like to lose someone very close. Priam's grief makes him pitiable, but Achilles' grief enables his pity for someone else. Where Aristotle locates the self-referential aspect of pity in fear, Homer locates it in grief. For Homer, It's the things we grieve over in our own case that we pity when they happen to others. An element of this closeness between pity and grief is apparent even in the Greek vocabulary that's used in the scene. Priam, as we've seen, asks Achilles directly for Elios in lines 503 to 4. But what Achilles is said to show in lines 513 to 518 isn't Elios, but oiktos. And as you know, there's controversy over possible differences of nuance and connotation between Elios and oiktos when both of these refer to the emotion that we call pity. Often enough, they seem to be used interchangeably. But oiktos is also commonly used in a sense that isn't shared by Elios, the sense of lamentation. And this is very likely to be the original sense of the term, because the term probably derives from the lamentatory interjection oi. So the term's semantic development no doubt reflects a perception of commonality between grieving and pitying. And this doesn't mean that Elios couldn't also rest on that similarity. The typical expression of Elios in grief in tears and weeping suggests that it could. But it's just that oiktos is especially appropriate here, where the link between Priam's grief, Achilles' grief, and Achilles' pity is so clearly drawn. The semantics of oiktos in general draw attention to a feature that's relevant also to Elios, that the common ground between pity and grief is tears and lamentation. Okay, so Priam's appeal to pity causes Achilles to grieve for his own losses, but the lamentation that expresses that grief forms part of the bridge between Priam's sorrows and the sorrows of Achilles that Priam tried to create in the first place. The way that grief for our own losses can inform pity for another human being highlights the self-referential aspect of pity. But it's also typical in Homer to identify explicitly the self-referential aspect of shared grief. And so now we move on to number 3 on the handout. So we see this self-referential aspect of grief when you grieve along with other people, twice in Iliad 19, for example. First of all, when the lament of Briseis over the body of Patroclus, in which she details her own considerable sufferings, is answered by the lamentation of the other captive women, each of whom grieves for her own misfortunes under the pretext of grieving for Patroclus. That's 19:301 to 2. Briseis' lament and the refrain that accompanies it are then followed by a speech of intense pain and anguish on the part of Achilles that contains some of the same motifs. But when Achilles imagines his father waiting at home for news of his son's death, his own death, the companions who join Achilles in lamentation each remember their own loved ones at home in 19:338 to 339. So just as in the Achilles and Priam scene of Iliad 24, one person's grief reminds other people of their own sorrows, and they weep and lament together. And we could document this further. There are many good examples, and I've given you a longer passage for comparison from Odyssey 4 in number 3 in the handout, but we don't have time to discuss that now. What these scenes of shared lamentation illustrate is the self-referential side of grief, but they still don't detract in any way from the pro-social side of grief, or the pro-social side of sharing someone's grief, compassion. In our main passage in Iliad 24, this is quite clear, not only because we have the narrator's word that Achilles is subject to oiktos in line 516, but we also recognize this because Achilles' thoughts of his father are deliberately provoked by Priam as a way of eliciting that oiktos, that sympathy. Though Priam underestimates the sorrows of Peleus, it's as a suffering individual that Peleus is invoked. And this involves an acceptance that reflection on your own sorrows is a basis for understanding the sorrows of other people. And Achilles confirms that acceptance in the speech that he gives about the jars of Zeus, the parable of the jars of Zeus. But the purpose of that speech is explicitly consolatory. The point is that other people suffer just as we do, and to realize that this is the case puts our own sufferings in perspective. We are not being singled out. This happens again and again to all of us. As Achilles puts it at the beginning and the end of his consolation, in line 524 and then again in line 550, there's nothing to be achieved by lamentation. We're not special. We all suffer in this way. And this is a lesson that Achilles himself appears to be learning almost in the very moment that he imparts that lesson to Priam. The man who at the beginning of book 24 was still dragging Hector's body around the grave of Patroclus before leaving it to lie face down in the dust, now advises Priam, that man's father, to behave as he does. He says, let's now let our pains be stored in our hearts, grieving though we are, in 522 to 23. But the fact that Achilles follows this with an elaborate set piece of authoritative speech, using the exemplary figures of Peleus and Priam to illustrate a fundamental piece of ancient Greek popular morality, suggests that the lesson that Achilles gives Priam is also a lesson for us. The way in which Achilles has come to deal with his emotions is now offered to Priam as a way of dealing with his, by means of a parable that suggests that if we recognize the universality of human vulnerability to suffering, then we all have a way of managing our emotions and our troubles. It's not just that understanding other people's sufferings and other people's emotional responses to suffering proves somehow to be beneficial to Achilles and Priam. It's rather that such an understanding is fundamental to the ways in which all human beings confront the inevitabilities of life. In a marked, exemplary passage such as this one, this must be a reflection of the poem's own sense of its ethos, its sense of its aesthetic, its sense of its utility, its function. The Iliad holds out the prospect that the encounter with other people's emotions in literature can help us manage our own emotions. We might confirm that the correlation of grief and pity is a fundamental aspect of the Iliad's ethos from a variety of sources, but it's especially apparent in those characteristic obituary notices or necrologies that are often used to mark the deaths of minor warriors. This is number 4 on the handout. As we know, for example, from the studies of Jasper Griffin, these necrologies share a number of motifs with laments. The most prominent of these in our main passage in Iliad 24 is the idea of the parents and especially the father's grief for the son killed in battle and the dead warrior's inability to look after his parents in their old age. The fact that these motifs and others like them occur also in necrologies confirms that the intended effect of the necrologies is pathos. And this is something that's central to the poem by Alice Oswald called Memorial. This is a poem that's based substantially on the necrologies of the Iliad. These necrologies, as Oswald observes, derive from the poetic tradition of the lament. And here I'll quote from Alice Oswald's preface to Memorial. She says, "I like to think that the stories of individual soldiers recorded in the Iliad might be recollections of these laments, woven into the narrative by poets who regularly performed both high epic and choral lyric poetry." The congruence of lament and necrology also confirms the closeness of grief and pity in Iliadic aesthetics. In necrologies, these pathetic motifs often speak for themselves, as in the case of Hippothous in Iliad 17, that's in number 4 on the handout. Like Achilles, Hippothous is short-lived and destined to die far from home, leaving his parents to mourn and to look after themselves in old age. What these motifs highlight is what Eric Colhead has recently described as grievability. And Colhead takes this term, grievability, from Judith Butler. This is number 5 on the handout. Butler's account resonates significantly, I think, with the Iliad. Grievability is predicated on vulnerability. It's predicated on the precariousness of human existence and on the fundamental fact of mortality in ways that have profound social and political implications. Not only are we fundamentally like everyone else, but that likeness implies forms of openness towards other people that subsume in the us, the people that we tend to regard as the them. Grievability depends on the inevitability of death and on the grief that goes with death. But it's also a feature, as Butler puts it, of life as it's lived. Just to begin the quotation that's there in number 5 on the handout, Butler says, precisely because a living being may die, it's necessary to care for that being so that it may live. Only under conditions in which the loss would matter does the value of the life appear. Thus, grievability is a presupposition for the life that matters. And Butler writes in general terms of our knowing, interpreting, recognizing, responding to, and being responsible for the grievability of others' lives. But she does also emphasize emotion, including horror, moral revulsion, shock, and outrage, but also respect and guilt. While the relations of mutual dependence that precariousness implies are not necessarily relations of love or even of care, as she puts it, love and care may be facilitated by these conditions. But in Butler's account, there's no explicit role for compassion. Compassion is not a word that occurs in the book. And when she talks about being touched, as she puts it, by other people's lives and deaths, it's in the context of the danger of partiality when our emotional responses to violence stop short of understanding and interpretation. That's number 6 on the handout. Now, this does presuppose a reasoned concern of a sort that does allow us to be touched by all lives and deaths, and that this concern is desirable, but it also belongs with Butler's general and wholly justified insistence on the need for more than just emotion, more than just judgment. We need to act. We need effective political action. The Iliad, by contrast, places greater emphasis on effective transformation as such, the change in our emotional states as such, both for characters in the narrative and implicitly for the audience of the narrative. Now, it's true, Achilles does insist on action. He says what we need is praxis, in lines 524 and 550. So we need action rather than persistence in grief. But the action that he advocates seems to consist more or less of concluding the rituals of mourning and getting on with our lives in all its vulnerability to continuing misfortune, continuing mutability. Equally, it's a feature of the Iliad that we should absolutely not minimize that Achilles' pity for Priam consists in dealing with his own sorrows, overcoming hatred, affirming the shared humanity of the opposite side, protecting and caring for an elderly man who's been crushed by his sufferings in war, and in the end, participating, at least to a certain extent, in the preparations for the funeral of his own worst enemy. And yet, after that funeral has taken place, as is repeatedly emphasized towards the end of the poem, the Trojan War will continue, just as war continued to be a way of life for all the Greek communities in which the Iliad was performed and read, whatever its emotional effect on the members of those communities. The Iliadic approach also differs from Butler's in linking grievability so strongly to a single emotion, to the emotion of pity. Whereas many necrologies present lamentatory topoi without explicit comment by a character or by the narrator, when we do get such comments, they confirm that the conditions that give rise to grief also give rise to pity. And we see this in number 7 on the handout, in Iliad 11, where the pathetic themes of death far away from home and lack of care after death for one's parents are embedded in a speech in which Patroclus expresses his pity and his sorrow at the sufferings of his comrades. This is Book 11, lines 814 to 818. And this goes, when he saw Eurypylus, the brave son of Menoetius, that's Patroclus, pitied him, octiri him, and lamenting, olophuromenos, he spoke winged words of address, O wretched ones, and so it goes on. So in this passage, pity, oiktos, and lamentation, olophuresthai, occur together. Earlier in the same book, the death of Iphidamas, a young husband killed far from his wife, attracts the explicit pity of the narrator himself in lines 241 to 243. So the narrator says here, so he fell on the spot and into the sleep of bronze, pitiable, oikros, trying to help his townsfolk, far from the wedded wife he'd wooed. He'd had no joy of her at all, though he'd given a lot to win her. In both those passages, we're dealing with oiktos, the pity term that also connotes lamentation. I'd say that the adjective oiktros, that's used in the second of those passages that I mentioned there, is the Greek for grievable. The crucial point here is that passages such as these present as pitiable what is, for the individual warrior's relatives and dependents, a source of grief. In contrast to Aristotle's position in the Rhetoric, that we pity in others what we fear happening to ourselves, the central aesthetic and affective appeal in the Iliad is that we pity in others not only what we grieve over when it happens to us, but also what we recognize as being grievable from the point of view of those who care for the individual in question. What we pity is actually or potentially someone else's grief. And we recognize that grievability, the potential for grief, on account of our own potential to suffer and to grieve. The fundamental point that human lives are inherently precarious and grievable permeates ancient Greek literature and thought. We could go on and on talking about this. If there were time, we'd return now to Aristotle and especially to the Poetics. We don't have time, and so I'll leave you with one general thought about Aristotle, the Poetics, and Plato. Whatever Aristotle may have meant by the term catharsis in chapter 6 of the Poetics, we can be sure that he regarded the audience's emotional response to tragic suffering as in some way beneficial. But it's a substantial difference between the Poetics and the Iliad that grief and grievability don't play a significant role in Aristotle's account. And this points to a further difference between Aristotle and Homer on the issue of the compassion that's aroused by the sufferings of other people. In his references to both pity and fear, Aristotle focuses almost entirely on our emotions as onlookers, as audience members. The encounter with the emotions of others that's so prominent in Homer plays no explicit role in the account of pity in the Rhetoric or in the theorization of pity's role as an audience response in drama in the Poetics. Aristotle's emphasis is on the fact of suffering and the fact of misfortune, not on the impact made on us by the way that the target of our pity responds emotionally to their own sufferings. And in this, Aristotle differs substantially from Plato, because Plato does place considerable emphasis on the display and performance of grief as the cause and object of pity in the audiences of epic and tragic poetry. And we see this in Republic 10, in the critique of the supposedly negative effects of epic and tragic poetry on the emotional well-being of their audiences. So we're now at number 8 on the handout. The important points for our purposes here are, first, that audience emotions focus directly on the emotions of characters in Plato. Second, pity responds in Plato to the expression of grief. Third, there's a significant degree of overlap between the experience and the expression of grief on the one hand and pity on the other. We express them both in very similar ways. Finally, there's a relation between the pity that we feel when others grieve and our own experience of grief. You notice in particular that the emotional reaction, according to Plato, according to Socrates in that passage, that we should restrain when we want to deal with our own misfortunes, is referred to as to eleinon, the pitiable. The lamentation that expresses grief is the pitiable par excellence. And whereas in Homer's Achilles' own experience of grief is the basis for his pity for Priam, here in the Republic, our pity for characters like Achilles and like Priam springs from the same source as the grief that we would feel over our own sufferings. In this passage, Plato agrees with Homer about the relation between pity and grief, but he disagrees completely with Homer over the idea that the encounter with others' emotions in tragic poetry can somehow help us manage our own. Plato doesn't believe that. Aristotle in the Poetics, of course, does believe that. He shares the Homeric view that the encounter with others' emotions in art and literature can help us manage our own. But perhaps Aristotle's awareness of the charge that sharing grief through pity risks losing the capacity for self-control. And maybe that's one reason why his own accounts of pity in the rhetoric and the Poetics relate it to the fear fostered by our vulnerability to potential misfortune in the future, rather than to the grievability, the grief that links others' lives to our own. Thank you very much.
May I? Is there any questions to formulate? Please, you can write them in the chat.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's very kind of you.
No, there is, yes, Miguel. Someone is. Somebody, Miguel Abrantes, PhD student, asks, is Aristotle's theorization of compassion still alive in our days? Or, in a world of COVID, social media and Zoom have the mechanics of compassion significantly changed to us as a society?
Well, the short answer is yes and no. So I wouldn't necessarily hold out Aristotle's theorization as the be-all and end-all here. So I think there are significantly more that we can add to Aristotle's account in the Poetics from the implicit conceptualization of pity in in Homer in the Iliad. So I would want to argue, and I'd want to emphasize that the points that Homer seems to have in common with Judith Butler about the precariousness of life, about the inherent grievability of life, and about the call that is made on us by the grievability not only of our own lives, but of the lives of other people. Those things are still very relevant. And those are things that Aristotle doesn't, I think, pay enough attention to. On the other hand, one of the central aspects of the way that Aristotle discusses the emotions in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, I think is relevant to your point about the contemporary situation. So, as I said, Aristotle doesn't say very much about being physically confronted by others' expressions of their own sufferings, by others' tears, by others' lamentation, by others' grief. He doesn't say a great deal about that at all. Just a very, very tiny bit about delivery and dress and that kind of thing. But he doesn't make much of that. He doesn't make it central to his account. But Aristotle, of course, believes that you, both in the Poetics and in the Rhetoric, that you don't necessarily need to see these things. They don't have to be present to you physically in your immediate physical space. So in the Poetics, for example, he emphasizes how we don't need to see the tragedy performed to be horrified and moved to pity by the fate of Oedipus. Just reading it is enough. And the reason why just reading it is enough is something that's central to the account of the emotions in the Rhetoric as well. They're forms of pleasure and pain, according to Aristotle, and pleasure and pain rely ultimately on aesthesis, on perception, sensation, and yet they can be mediated also by something that he calls a weak form of sensation, a weak form of aesthesis, namely Fantasia Imagination. And this is, I think, is something that is being brought out in Iliad 24 as well. It takes imagination to think about others' conditions as well as about our own. Aristotle talks about several ways in which we may be, it may be more difficult for us to think about other people and how they're suffering if we're too absorbed with our own sufferings, for example. But he does think it's possible to imaginatively conjure up scenarios of other people's sufferings and therefore to respond to them in that way with emotion too. So even through Zoom, even through the TV, even through the newsreel, even through works of fiction and film, we can still respond to other people's sufferings. I don't think that's necessarily being diminished by the fact that we all now stay indoors and see each other only virtually. I think, in fact, we're dying to get out and see each other physically again.
Thank you. Well, we have another question, but before the question is put, I have to read a commentary of Tomás Figueira. Bravo, Douglas. Sensitive analysis, beautifully wrought.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Thank you for listening.
So, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
Oh, okay, fine. I co-organized a panel on necropolitics. So please forgive me that I'm a little focused on grief and lamentation.
No problem, Marian. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Douglas. Now, what I wanted to ask is, do you see any gender difference in the expectation towards grief and lamentation, for the female part of the population, and also, then the pity aspect? But I mean, this is not a critique at all, of course, for the written sources that are male orientated. But I mean, it's a concern for everybody, and we, of course, talked a lot about the female side. So I just wonder whether you had a comment on that.
Yeah, of course, there's a gender dimension. So the lament of Briseis in Iliad 19, as Casey Douay has brought out very well, is emblematic for the predicament of captive women in the Iliad. And of course, the other captive women in that scene in Iliad 19 do lament, and they lament in a traditional way. So it's expressed in oral formulaic terms, and it's expressed in terms of a traditional performance, a traditional ritualized performance too. So there's the lead mourner, and there's the refrain by the collective of women there too. And we see this again and again in the Iliad, and it's something also that Meg Alexiou has studied at length in a still seminal study of the ritual lament in Greek tradition. And so in the lamentations in Iliad 22, when Hector dies, and in the lamentations when his body is taken back to Troy in Iliad 24, women are prominent. Women are the lead mourners, and women respond epi de stenakonto genaikes and so on in those scenes as well. But the distinction in Homer, at least, isn't absolute. I mean, I know there are gendered roles in funerals in classical Athenian context too, and on black and red figure vases and in sculptural representations as well. And there are different gestures appropriate to men and women, different locations in the visual scene and so on. But in Homer, the distinction isn't absolute. So, for example, in Iliad 24, as we prepare for the funeral of Hector, and there are these laments by people like Andromache and Helen and Hecuba, the refrain is not always solely the responsibility of the women. It can also be the responsibility of the demos in general. The whole population joins in. And in the case that I cited in Iliad 19, although you've got the emblematic case of a female mourner, a female captive mourning in the case of Briseis, joined by the other captive women in responding to her like a kind of chorus, immediately after that, when Achilles grieves and imagines the sufferings of his father, we have the same formula, the same epi de stenakonto formula applied to Achilles' male companions as they support him in his grief. So there is quite a lot of evidence, in fact, for male individuals performing aspects of mourning, ritual mourning, that are more commonly associated with female individuals. And Suter has a very good book on that subject.
And well,
for the loudspeaker.
Again.
No. Thank you. I just wanted to explain that I vanished from the screen because I had to go to the loudspeaker to hear you. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
She has a second question. That I will read. If I may, and the second question, if I may, what would you say is the relationship between tumors and grieving? Is there a relationship between tumors and grieving?
It's complicated because thumos in Plato doesn't mean what it means in Homer. Thumos in Aristotle doesn't mean what it means in either Plato or Homer. We've got very good examples in the passages I gave you from Iliad 10 of what Plato thinks about grieving. It's controversial in that context, though, whether Plato is linking grief with the Thumoides as an aspect of the tripartite soul in the Republic, or what seems to be more likely to be the case with the epithumetikon. So in that passage, Plato brings out something that's in fact very, very common in Homeric scenes of grieving, that there is a kind of appetite for grieving. There's a desire to grieve, and you satisfy that desire in very much the same way as you satisfy the desires for food and drink. And it's a formula in the Homeric poems that when they had put aside this appetite for grieving, in the same way as it's a formula when they had put aside their appetite for food and drink. So both in Plato and in Homer, there is that relation between appetite and grief. There's a kind of something that Aristotle brings out also in the Poetics. There's some kind of paradoxical pleasure in this. Or as, for example, Gorgias brings out in the Helen, There is this longing that loves to grieve, this pothos philopenthes, as Gorgias puts it. So all of these things associate grief with appetite, not necessarily with what you might think of as thumos in Platonic terms. But of course, in Homer, thumos isn't that. And thumos is associated with just about every function of a human being. So thumos can be something that is associated with thought, so discursive thought, rational thought, ratiocination in Homer. It can be associated with emotions, not only anger, but also grief and pity. And it can be associated with appetites as well. It's complicated to say what thumos is in Homer, because it belongs to a family of terms, all of which execute very, very similar functions, and which are used almost entirely interchangeably in the way that they execute those functions. So as well as thumos in Homer, you can't fetishize thumos and say thumos does this, this, and this in Homer, because this, and this in Homer are done also by the phrenes, by the cradie, by the ator, by the prapides, and things like that too, and also in the chest. So these things are differentiated formulaically in Homer. They're differentiated by their function as aspects of the meter and the material of formulaic composition. They're not differentiated by desiderative, emotional, or intellectual functions. So it's a really complicated question. You would have to read a very, very big German book called Zum Wortfeld Seele, Geist in der Sprache Homers, really to understand it.
Well, I think you were generous enough by answering to thank you, Douglas, Professor Douglas Cairns, for your brilliant lesson, and we hope that you will be soon among us to to bring more lessons and to teach us. So
well, and to learn from everyone too. So thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. Thank you to those in the room in Coimbra. I wish I was there with you, and thank you to all who've tuned in, whom I haven't been able to see, sadly, on the YouTube channel. And I do hope we can all meet again very soon in Coimbra.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.